The gunshot that killed Lila's father echoed through the dusty streets of Rock Springs, Wyoming on a blistering August afternoon in 1882. And she knew before the sheriff arrived at their mercantile that her entire world had just collapsed. Carson Everett heard the shot from 3 buildings down where he'd been loading supplies onto his wagon, his hands already beginning their familiar tremor as the adrenaline coursed through his system, and he cursed under his breath because he'd forgotten to take his tonic that morning. The illness had been creeping through his body for 6 months now. A progressive palsy the traveling doctor in Cheyenne had diagnosed with grim certainty, telling him he had perhaps 2 years before the tremors would consume him entirely and leave him unable to work, unable to ride, unable to do anything but wait for the inevitable end. Carson had kept the diagnosis to himself, not even telling his ranch foreman or the few men he employed to help run his modest cattle operation 15 miles outside of town. He was only 26 years old, too young to be facing this kind of sentence, and the injustice of it burned in his chest every morning when he woke to find his hands shaking worse than the day before. He developed elaborate strategies to hide the tremors, keeping his hands busy with rope or reins, clasping them behind his back when he spoke to people, drinking from a canteen instead of a glass whenever possible. The bottle of laudanum-laced tonic he'd gotten from the doctor helped some, but he hated the foggy feeling it gave him and tried to use it sparingly. Now he stood in the street watching people rush toward the source of the gunshot, and something in his gut told him to follow. Maybe it was the physician's warning about stress making his condition worse. Maybe it was simple human decency, but Carson found himself joining the crowd that gathered outside the mercantile. The sheriff was already there, kneeling beside a man who lay motionless in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. Carson recognized William Dawson, the mercantile owner, a decent man who'd always given fair prices and never cheated on the scales. A young woman burst through the shop door, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her gray eyes wild with panic. Carson had seen her before, working in her father's store, but they'd never spoken beyond brief pleasantries. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features and capable hands that now reached desperately for her father's body. "Papa!" Lila Dawson's voice cracked with anguish as she dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the blood soaking into her calico skirt. "Papa, please, no, no, no." The sheriff caught her shoulders gently. "Miss Dawson, I'm sorry. He's gone." Carson watched her face transform from denial to devastation, and something in his chest tightened painfully. The crowd murmured around them, and he caught fragments of conversation. Apparently, a drifter had tried to rob the mercantile, and when William Dawson had refused to hand over the money, the man had shot him and fled on horseback, heading east toward the open prairie. "I'll get a posse together," the sheriff announced, standing. "Anyone willing to ride?" Several men volunteered immediately, but Carson found himself stepping back. His hands were trembling badly now, and he needed to get somewhere private before anyone noticed. He turned away from the scene, guilt gnawing at him for his cowardice, and made his way back to his wagon. He pulled out the bottle of tonic from his saddlebag and took a long swallow, wincing at the bitter taste. Over the next 3 days, Carson couldn't get the image of Lila Dawson's grief-stricken face out of his mind. The posse had returned empty-handed, the killer having vanished into the vast Wyoming territory. The funeral was held on a gray morning that threatened rain, and Carson attended along with most of the town. He stood at the back of the cemetery, keeping his distance, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets to hide their shaking. He watched Lila stand beside the grave, her face pale and composed now, though her eyes held a hollowness that spoke of sleepless nights and endless tears. She wore black mourning clothes that made her look even more fragile, and Carson wondered if she had any other family. He'd heard through town gossip that her mother had died when Lila was just a child, and William Dawson had raised her alone while running the mercantile. After the funeral, Carson learned that Lila was trying to keep the store running by herself, which seemed like an impossible task. The mercantile was one of the largest businesses in Rock Springs, supplying not just the town but also the surrounding ranches and the occasional wagon train passing through. It required constant restocking, managing accounts, dealing with suppliers, and handling the physical labor of moving heavy crates and barrels. A week after the funeral, Carson rode into town needing to purchase supplies. His hands had been particularly bad that morning, the tremors so severe he'd barely been able to button his shirt. He'd taken extra tonic, enough to steady himself somewhat, though the foggy sensation in his head made him feel disconnected from his body. He tied his horse outside the mercantile and stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. The store was dim and smelled of flour, coffee, and dried herbs. Lila stood behind the counter, trying to hoist a large sack of grain onto a shelf. She was clearly struggling with the weight, her face flushed with effort. "Let me help you with that," Carson said, moving forward automatically. She turned, startled, and the sack slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. "I can manage," she said, her voice carrying a defensive edge. "I know you can," Carson replied gently. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered." Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them, an understanding perhaps of what it meant to struggle alone. Lila's expression softened slightly and she nodded. Carson bent to lift the sack, concentrating hard on keeping his hand steady. The tonic was working, thankfully, and he managed to lift the grain and place it on the shelf without incident. "Thank you," Lila said quietly. "I'm sorry for snapping." "It's been difficult." "No apology needed," Carson assured her. He picked up a basket and began gathering the items he needed, aware of her watching him. When he brought his purchases to the counter, she tallied them efficiently, her fingers moving quickly over the ledger. "That will be $3.40, she said. Carson reached for his money, but as he pulled out the bills, his right hand began to tremble visibly. He tried to control it, clenching his jaw, but the tremor only intensified. Lila's eyes dropped to his shaking hand, and he saw her notice. Heat flooded his face with embarrassment and anger at his own body's betrayal. He managed to place the money on the counter, rather than handing it to her directly. "Keep the change," he muttered, grabbing his supplies and turning toward the door. "Wait," Lila called after him. "You have 60 cents coming back. Consider it payment for your trouble," Carson said without turning around, and pushed through the door into the harsh sunlight. He loaded his supplies with shaking hands, cursing himself for being so abrupt with her. She'd just been doing her job, and he'd practically run out of there like a scared animal. But the thought of her seeing his weakness, of having to explain, was more than he could bear. For the next 2 weeks, Carson avoided town entirely, sending his ranch foreman in to handle any necessary business. He threw himself into work on his ranch, spending long hours in the saddle checking fence lines and moving cattle, anything to keep his mind occupied. The physical labor helped somewhat, though he noticed his endurance wasn't what it used to be. The illness was progressing exactly as the doctor had warned. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink over the prairie, Carson sat on his porch trying to roll a cigarette. His hands shook so badly that tobacco spilled everywhere, and he finally gave up in frustration, throwing the paper aside. He'd been fooling himself thinking he could manage this ranch alone for much longer. Soon, the tremors would be too severe to hide, and then what? He'd become an object of pity, unable to work, slowly deteriorating until he couldn't even feed himself. The darkness of these thoughts was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching. Carson stood, squinting into the dusk, and was surprised to see a small figure on horseback. As the rider drew closer, he recognized Lila Dawson. She dismounted with practiced ease and tied her horse to the porch rail. "Mr. Everett," she greeted him formally. "Miss Dawson," he replied, confused by her presence. "Is something wrong?" "I need to hire someone," Lila said, climbing the porch steps to stand before him. "The mercantile is too much for one person to manage alone. I need help with the heavy lifting, restocking, and inventory. I was hoping you might know someone reliable who'd be interested in the work." Carson studied her face in the fading light. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but there was determination in the set of her jaw. "Why come all the way out here to ask me?" "Because everyone in town says you're honest and fair in your dealings," Lila replied. "And I figured a rancher would know hard-working men." He did know several men who might be interested, but before he could suggest any names, a different idea formed in his mind. It was reckless and probably foolish, but the loneliness of his self-imposed isolation had been weighing on him. "What if I did it?" Carson heard himself say. Lila looked surprised. But you have a ranch to run." "I have a good foreman and 3 ranch hands. They can manage things for a while, and I could use some extra income." That last part wasn't true. His ranch was profitable enough, but it gave him a plausible excuse. She hesitated, and he could see her working through the implications. "The pay isn't much, 50 cents a day. That's fair." "And I saw your hands shaking that day in the store," Lila said bluntly. "Will you be able to handle the physical work?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most people were too polite to mention such things, preferring to pretend they hadn't noticed. "Some days are worse than others," Carson admitted carefully, "but I'm still capable of working." Lila regarded him for a long moment, and he forced himself to meet her gaze steadily despite his embarrassment. Finally, she nodded. "All right, can you start Monday?" "Monday's fine." She untied her horse and mounted smoothly. 6 in the morning. Don't be late, Mr. Everett. Call me Carson." "Then you should call me Lila." She turned her horse and started back toward town, calling over her shoulder, "See you Monday, Carson." He watched her ride away until she disappeared into the darkness, wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. Working in close quarters with Lila Dawson would make hiding his condition much more difficult, but something about her directness appealed to him. She'd seen his trembling hands and hired him anyway, not treating him like he was made of glass or beyond help. That night, Carson slept better than he had in weeks. Monday morning arrived cool and clear, with autumn beginning to touch the edges of the prairie grass. Carson rode into Rock Springs just as the sun was rising, painting the wooden buildings in shades of gold. His hands were steady this morning, thankfully, and he'd taken only a small dose of tonic. Lila was already unlocking the mercantile when he arrived. She'd tied her dark hair back in a practical bun, and she wore a simple gray dress with an apron over it. "Morning," she greeted him with a small smile. "Ready to work. Lead the way." She put him to work immediately, showing him where everything was stored and explaining the system her father had developed for organizing inventory. Carson was impressed by how thoroughly she understood the business. She knew exactly what items sold quickly and needed frequent restocking, which suppliers were reliable, and how to negotiate better prices. "Your father taught you well," Carson commented as they hauled crates from the storeroom. Lila's expression softened with memory. "He started teaching me the business when I was 8 years old. I think he always knew I'd take over someday, though I wish it hadn't happened so soon." They worked side by side throughout the morning, and Carson found himself enjoying the rhythm of it. When customers came in, Lila handled them with friendly efficiency while Carson continued with the physical tasks. Around noon, she produced sandwiches and coffee, and they ate lunch sitting on crates in the storeroom. "Why did you really offer to work here?" Lila asked between bites. "You're a rancher. This has to be boring for you." Carson considered his answer carefully. "Ranching is lonely work. Long days with just cattle and horses for company. Sometimes it's nice to be around people." "Is that why you haven't married?" The question was bold, but Lila seemed genuinely curious rather than prying. "Partly," Carson admitted. The truth was more complicated. He'd been courting a woman in Cheyenne before his diagnosis, but after learning about his illness, he'd broken things off without explanation. It hadn't seemed fair to saddle anyone with a husband who'd soon be an invalid. "What about you? A woman who runs a successful business must have suitors." Lila laughed, but there was no humor in it. Men don't want a wife who's smarter with numbers than they are, or who can negotiate a better deal. They want someone soft and compliant. That's not me. "Then they're fools," Carson said simply. She looked at him with surprise, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "That's kind of you to say." Over the following weeks, they settled into a comfortable routine. Carson arrived each morning at 6 and worked until closing time, then rode back to his ranch to check on things before dark. His foreman had everything well in hand, which was both reassuring and somewhat depressing. It proved that Carson wasn't as essential to the ranch's operation as he'd liked to believe. His hands continued their unpredictable pattern, some days nearly normal, other days shaking badly. He learned to work around it, doing heavy lifting on bad days when fine motor control didn't matter, and handling delicate tasks like measuring dry goods on good days. Lila never commented on it, though he caught her watching him sometimes with a thoughtful expression. They talked while they worked, gradually sharing more about their lives. Carson learned that Lila's mother had died of influenza when Lila was 9, and that she'd essentially run the household while her father ran the store. She could cook, sew, keep accounts, and bargain with suppliers like a seasoned businessman. Her father had treated her as a partner rather than just a daughter, unusual for the times but clearly effective. Lila learned that Carson had inherited his ranch from an uncle who'd had no children of his own. He'd been working it for 5 years, building it up slowly into a profitable operation. He described the satisfaction of watching his herd grow, the beauty of sunrise over the prairie, the harsh winters that tested every rancher's mettle. What he didn't tell her was about his illness, though he suspected she'd figured out it was more than just nervous tremors. She was too observant, too intelligent not to notice the pattern. But she never pushed him to explain, and he was grateful for that. In early October, a freight wagon arrived with a large shipment of supplies for the mercantile. The driver helped unload the heavy items, but when he left, dozens of crates and barrels still needed to be moved into the storeroom and properly stored. Carson and Lila worked late into the evening, long after closing time, shifting inventory and reorganizing shelves. "Last one," Lila announced, pointing to a particularly large barrel of molasses. Carson was exhausted, his muscles aching, and his hands had been trembling for the past hour. He bent to roll the barrel, but his grip slipped. The barrel tilted dangerously, and he lunged to catch it, but his hands shook too badly to hold on properly. The barrel would have crashed to the floor if Lila hadn't jumped forward and helped him steady it. They stood there for a moment, both gripping the barrel, breathing hard. Then Lila looked up at him, and something in her eyes made his heart clench. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" she said quietly. Carson wanted to deny it to make some excuse, but he was so tired of hiding. "Yes." "What is it?" "The shaking, progressive palsy. That's what the doctor called it. It'll keep getting worse until I can't use my hands at all, maybe a year or two before I'm completely helpless." The words came out bitter, and he hated the weakness in his voice. Lila's expression didn't change to pity as he'd feared. Instead, she looked thoughtful. "Does it hurt?" "No. It's just frustrating as hell." Together, they maneuvered the barrel into place. When they finished, Lila wiped her hands on her apron and met his eyes directly. "Thank you for telling me. You would have figured it out eventually anyway," Carson said. "You're too smart not to, maybe. But I'm glad you trusted me with the truth." She paused, then added, "It doesn't change anything, you know. You're still the best help I've ever had here." Something warm bloomed in Carson's chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of something deeper. "Thank you," he said, meaning it for more than just her words. They locked up the store together, and Carson insisted on riding with Lila partway home since it was dark. She lived above the mercantile in rooms that had been her family's home for years, but she'd been staying with a widow friend recently, uncomfortable with living alone so soon after her father's death. As they rode through the quiet streets, their horses walking side by side, Carson found himself acutely aware of Lila's presence. The moonlight caught in her dark hair, and her profile was lovely in the silvery light. He'd been trying not to think of her in romantic terms, telling himself it was unfair to develop feelings for someone when he had no future to offer. But his heart had other ideas. "Carson," Lila said suddenly, "would you like to have dinner with me on Sunday? I mean a proper dinner, not just sandwiches between customers." His heart skipped. "Are you sure that's wise? People will talk. Let them talk. I'm tired of doing what's proper and expected. Life's too short." Her voice carried an edge of defiance born from loss. Losing her father had clearly changed her perspective on wasting time. "Then yes," Carson agreed. "I'd like that very much." Sunday arrived with crisp autumn weather, leaves turning gold and orange on the few trees that grew near town. Carson spent more time than usual getting ready, shaving carefully despite his shaking hands, putting on his best shirt and vest. He felt nervous as a schoolboy, which was ridiculous given his age. Lila had decided to cook dinner in the apartment above the mercantile, having moved back there the previous day. When Carson arrived, climbing the exterior stairs to the second floor, she greeted him at the door wearing a deep blue dress that brought out the gray in her eyes. "Come in," she said with a smile. "Everything's almost ready." The apartment was cozy and surprisingly homey, with lace curtains on the windows and photographs on the walls. Carson recognized William Dawson in several of them, and a woman who must have been Lila's mother. The table was set for two, with candles providing soft light. Lila had made roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, and the smell was incredible. They sat down to eat, and Carson couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed a meal more. It wasn't just the food, though that was excellent, but the company. Lila was witty and engaging, telling stories about growing up in the mercantile, and some of the more eccentric customers her father had dealt with over the years. "There was this old prospector," she said, laughing, "who insisted on paying for his supplies in gold dust, but he was always convinced we were trying to cheat him on the weight. He'd stand there for an hour watching Papa measure it, accusing him of rigging the scales." "What did your father do?" Carson asked, grinning. "Finally let the man measure it himself. Turned out the prospector couldn't read the scales properly and had been shorting us by half on every transaction. When Papa showed him, the old man was so embarrassed he made up the difference and never questioned us again." After dinner, they moved to the small sitting area, and Lila served coffee. Carson noticed his hands were shaking as he reached for his cup, and he hesitated, not wanting to spill. Without a word, Lila reached over and wrapped her hands around his, steadying them. Her touch was warm and gentle, and Carson found himself frozen, staring at their joined hands. "I know," Lila said softly, looking directly into his eyes. "I know you're scared. I know you think this illness means you can't have a normal life, can't let anyone close. But I need you to understand something, Carson Everett. I don't care about your trembling hands. I care about the man attached to them." His throat tightened with emotion. "Lila, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm choosing." Her gray eyes were fierce. "Do you think I don't know what it's like to face an uncertain future? My father was murdered in broad daylight. Life is unpredictable and often cruel. But that doesn't mean we should push away the good things when they come." "You deserve better than a man who'll eventually be helpless," Carson said, his voice rough. "I deserve someone who treats me as an equal, who respects my mind as much as my appearance, who makes me laugh and challenges me to think. That's you, Carson. Everything else we'll figure out together." He wanted to argue, to list all the reasons this was a bad idea, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself leaning forward, and Lila met him halfway. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepened with all the emotion they'd been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, Carson rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he admitted. "Probably have been since the day I watched you hoist that grain sack." Lila laughed softly. "I've been falling for you since you helped me with it, despite clearly having every reason to keep your distance. You're brave, Carson, even if you don't think so." They spent the rest of the evening talking, making plans, acknowledging the challenges ahead but refusing to let them dictate their choices. When Carson finally rode home that night, his heart felt lighter than it had in months. Over the next several weeks, they became inseparable. Carson continued working at the mercantile during the day, and they spent their evenings together, either at Lila's apartment or riding out to Carson's ranch. The town gossips had plenty to say about their courtship, but neither of them cared. Lila had been right. Life was too short to worry about propriety. Carson's illness progressed slowly but steadily. There were days when his hands shook so badly he could barely hold a fork, and Lila would help him without making him feel diminished. She learned to anticipate his needs, setting out his coffee in a mug with handles on both sides for better grip, cutting his meat when necessary, buttoning his shirt on particularly bad mornings. "I hate that you have to do this," Carson said one morning as Lila fastened the buttons on his vest. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because you think it makes you less of a man. Carson, strength isn't just physical. You're one of the strongest people I know." "I'm sick, Lila. Weak." "You're dealing with an illness with grace and courage. That's not weakness." She finished the last button and kissed him softly. "Besides, I like taking care of you. It makes me feel useful." In December, 3 days before Christmas, Carson proposed. It wasn't fancy or elaborate. They were in the mercantile storeroom, taking inventory, when Carson suddenly stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. "Marry me," he said simply. Lila looked up from her ledger, surprised. "What? Marry me?" Carson repeated. "I know I'm not the best prospect, and things will probably get harder before they get better, but I love you more than I thought possible. I want whatever time I have to be spent with you." Tears welled in Lila's eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." He pulled a small box from his pocket, and inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing I have from her. If you don't like it, I love it," Lila interrupted, slipping it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I love you." They were married in January of 1883, in a small ceremony at the Rock Springs Church with just a handful of friends present. Lila wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple but elegant in ivory silk, and Carson wore his best suit despite needing Lila's help with the buttons and tie. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Carson kissed his bride with trembling hands that Lila held steady. They combined households, with Carson selling his ranch house and moving into the apartment above the mercantile. He kept the ranch land and hired his foreman to manage operations, providing them with income while allowing Carson to focus on helping Lila with the store. It was a practical arrangement that worked well for both of them. Married life suited them. They worked together during the day, and in the evenings, they cooked together, read together, and talked about everything under the sun. Lila was fascinated by Carson's knowledge of ranching and the land, while he loved her quick mind and business acumen. They were partners in the truest sense, each complementing the other's strengths and supporting their weaknesses. As winter turned to spring, Carson's condition continued to deteriorate. There were days when he couldn't work at all, the tremors so severe he had to stay in bed. Lila hired a young man to help with the heavy lifting at the store, but she always made sure Carson knew he was still needed and valued. "You're better at dealing with difficult customers than anyone," she told him after he'd successfully negotiated with a cantankerous rancher who'd been disputing his bill. "That's worth more than being able to lift crates." In late spring, they received news that lifted their spirits considerably. A new doctor had opened a practice in Cheyenne, someone who'd studied in the East and was knowledgeable about neurological conditions. Lila insisted they go see him, and though Carson was skeptical, he agreed. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days by train, and seeing the doctor took another full day of examinations and questions. The physician was thorough, testing Carson's reflexes, coordination, and strength. Finally, he sat them down in his office. "Mr. Everett, I believe you were misdiagnosed," the doctor said carefully. "What you have appears to be a severe essential tremor, not progressive palsy. While it's a chronic condition that may worsen over time, it's not degenerative in the way you were told. With proper medication and management, you could live a completely normal lifespan." Carson stared at him, unable to process the words. But the other doctor said. The other doctor was wrong. Essential tremor can be severe, and yours certainly is, but it won't leave you helpless. We have medications that can help manage the symptoms, and there are techniques you can learn to work around the limitations. Lila gripped Carson's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Are you certain?" "As certain as medical science allows." "I want to try a new medication regimen and see you back in 3 months for follow-up, but I'm confident we can improve your quality of life significantly." The train ride home was a blur of emotion. Carson kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream, but Lila was real and solid beside him, holding his hand and planning their future with characteristic enthusiasm. "We should expand the mercantile," she said. "Add a section for ranching equipment since you know so much about what ranchers need, and maybe eventually open a second location, though that's years away." Carson listened to her dreams and felt his own beginning to form. He'd spent so long assuming he had no future that he'd forgotten how to hope for one. But now, with Lila beside him and a corrected diagnosis, the world seemed full of possibilities again. The new medication helped tremendously. Within weeks, Carson's tremors had reduced to manageable levels. They didn't disappear entirely. The doctor had been clear that they never would, but they were no longer debilitating. Carson found he could handle most tasks independently again, though he still had bad days when the shaking worsened. "It's like having a weather vane in my hands," he joked to Lila one morning. "If they're shaking badly, I know a storm's coming," she laughed. "That's actually not far from the truth. Stress and fatigue make them worse. You need to pace yourself better." Over the next year, they threw themselves into building their business and their life together. The mercantile expanded just as Lila had envisioned, with Carson's expertise in ranching equipment drawing customers from all over the territory. They hired 2 full-time employees, allowing them both to take occasional days off. In the summer of 1884, Lila discovered she was pregnant. Carson's joy was tempered with worry. His hands still shook, and he wondered if he'd be able to hold a baby safely, change diapers, do all the things a father should do. "We'll figure it out," Lila assured him, "the same way we've figured everything else out, together." Their son was born in February of 1885, a healthy baby boy they named William Carson Everett, after Lila's father. Carson cried when he held his son for the first time, his hands trembling but secure as Lila guided him. Little William was perfect, with dark hair like his mother and blue eyes that would eventually turn gray. Fatherhood brought challenges Carson had anticipated, and many he hadn't. There were times his hands shook too badly to hold the baby safely, and he had to ask Lila for help. But there were also quiet moments in the night when he rocked William to sleep, singing old songs his own father had sung to him, and felt a completeness he'd never known before. As William grew from infant to toddler, Carson adapted. He learned to do things differently than other fathers might, but he did them. He played with his son, taught him, loved him fiercely. William didn't care that his father's hands shook sometimes. To him, Carson was simply Papa, the man who made him laugh and told him stories and kept him safe. In the spring of 1887, Lila announced she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with persistent nausea and fatigue, but she remained determined to keep working at the mercantile as long as possible. Carson and their employees took over more of the physical tasks, and Lila focused on the accounting and customer service she enjoyed most. Their daughter was born in October, a tiny thing with her father's blonde hair and her mother's determined spirit. They named her Sarah Mee Everett, and she completed their family in a way Carson hadn't realized was missing. William, now 2.5, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. The mercantile continued to thrive, becoming one of the most successful businesses in Rock Springs. Carson's knowledge and Lila's business sense proved an unbeatable combination, and they earned a reputation for fair dealing and quality goods. They never forgot the struggles that had brought them together, and they made a point of helping others when they could, extending credit to families facing hard times, donating supplies to the church for those in need, mentoring young people interested in learning business skills. Carson's health remained stable with medication, though he still had difficult days. The tremors never fully disappeared, but they also never progressed to the severity he'd once feared. He learned to accept them as part of who he was, not something to be ashamed of or hidden. One evening in the fall of 1889, Carson and Lila sat on the porch of their apartment, watching the sun set over the Wyoming prairie. William was playing with his toy horses on the floor, making sound effects for their imaginary adventures, while baby Sarah slept peacefully in her cradle. "Do you ever think about that first day you came to work at the mercantile?" Lila asked, leaning against Carson's shoulder. "All the time," he admitted. "I was so scared you'd see me as weak, as damaged goods." "I saw you as brave," Lila corrected. "You were dealing with something terrifying and you were still trying to help others. That's not weakness, Carson. That's strength." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for seeing me that way, for seeing past the shaking hands to the man underneath." "Thank you for letting me," Lila replied. She held up her hand, and Carson placed his trembling one against it, their fingers interlacing. "These hands built our business, held our children, loved me through good days and bad. I wouldn't change a single thing about them." Carson felt his throat tighten with emotion. 7 years ago, he'd been convinced his life was ending, that he had nothing to offer anyone. Now he had a wife he adored, 2 beautiful children, a successful business, and a future bright with promise. The trembling hands that had once seemed like a curse had become just another part of his story, a challenge he'd faced and overcome not alone, but with Lila by his side. "I love you," he said simply, because sometimes the simplest words carried the deepest truth. "I know," Lila replied with a soft smile, echoing the words she'd spoken that pivotal night when she'd held his trembling hands steady and changed both their lives forever. "I love you too." As the years passed, the Everett family became a cornerstone of the Rock Springs community. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and numbers, clearly inheriting his mother's head for business. Sarah was wild and adventurous, always getting into mischief and exploring places she shouldn't, reminding Carson of himself as a boy. In 1892, they expanded the mercantile again, purchasing the adjacent building and breaking through the wall to create one large store. The grand reopening was a community event, with half the town turning out to see the improvements. Carson stood beside Lila, his hand trembling slightly as always but steady in hers, and felt profound gratitude for the path his life had taken. The following year brought challenges when a severe winter hit Wyoming, with temperatures dropping far below zero and snow accumulating in massive drifts. Many ranchers lost cattle, and some families faced real hardship. The Everetts responded by extending credit liberally and organizing community efforts to help those most in need. Their generosity was remembered long after the spring thaw came. In 1895, Lila surprised Carson with news of another pregnancy. They were both older now. Carson was 39 and Lila 35, but the pregnancy progressed smoothly. Their third child, a son they named Thomas Edward Everett, arrived in May with lungs that announced his presence to the entire town. He was a happy, easy baby who rarely cried and smiled at everyone. William was now 10 and already helping significantly at the mercantile after school, learning the business from the ground up just as Lila had from her father. Sarah, at 7, was less interested in business and more fascinated by horses and the outdoors. She'd convinced Carson to teach her to ride, and despite the difficulty his shaking hands sometimes presented, he'd managed to teach her well. She had a natural seat and fearless spirit that both worried and impressed him. The turn of the century found the Everett family prosperous and happy. The mercantile had weathered economic downturns and competition, remaining successful through their commitment to quality and fairness. Carson's health had remained relatively stable, with the tremors no better or worse than they'd been years before. He'd learned to live with them, work around them, and most importantly, not let them define who he was. On New Year's Day 1900, Carson and Lila took a rare day off, leaving the children with trusted friends and riding out to the land where Carson's ranch still operated. They stood on a hill overlooking the valley, watching the cattle graze peacefully in the winter sun. 20 years ago, I thought my life was over," Carson said quietly. "I'd been given what I believed was a death sentence, and I couldn't imagine a future worth living. And now?" Lila prompted, though she knew the answer. "Now I have everything I never dared to dream of. A wife who's my partner in every sense of the word, 3 incredible children, a business we built together, a community we're part of." He turned to face her, his hand still trembling but steady enough, cupping her face gently. "You saved me, Lila, not just by loving me but by refusing to let me give up on myself." "We saved each other," Lila corrected. I was drowning in grief and responsibility when you walked into that mercantile. You gave me hope again, reminded me that life could be more than just surviving. They kissed as they had countless times over the years, a familiar comfort that never lost its spark. Around them, Wyoming stretched vast and beautiful, the land they'd chosen to build their life upon. As they rode back to town, Carson thought about the journey that had brought them here. The gunshot that killed William Dawson had been a tragedy that changed both their lives, setting in motion a chain of events neither could have predicted. His illness, which he'd viewed as a curse, had ultimately led him to work at the mercantile and fall in love with Lila. The trembling hands he'd tried so desperately to hide had become the very thing that brought them together, the moment of vulnerability that allowed Lila to see his true character. Life had taught him that weakness and strength weren't opposites, but often intertwined, that accepting help wasn't failure but wisdom, that love could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. His hands still shook, probably always would, but they'd held everything that mattered: his wife, his children, the reins of his horse, the ledgers of their business. They'd built a good life, those trembling hands and the steady ones that held them. Back in Rock Springs, their children greeted them with enthusiasm, William proudly reporting that he'd helped a customer find exactly the right supplies for a building project. Sarah showing off a drawing she'd made of their family, and little Thomas demanding to be picked up and cuddled. Carson obliged, lifting his youngest son despite the tremor in his arms, holding him close and breathing in the sweet scent of childhood. That night, after the children were asleep and the apartment was quiet, Carson and Lila sat together in their bedroom. It was a ritual they'd developed over the years, these quiet moments at the end of each day when they could talk without interruption, sharing their thoughts and dreams and concerns. "William asked me today if he has to take over the mercantile someday," Lila said, brushing out her hair at the vanity. "What did you tell him?" "That he should do what makes him happy. The mercantile will be there if he wants it, but we won't force him into a life he doesn't choose." She met Carson's eyes in the mirror. "My father never gave me that choice. He just assumed I'd help with the store, and I did because I loved him and wanted to please him. But I want our children to have options." Carson nodded agreement. "William's got a good head for business, but I've noticed he spends a lot of time reading those law books Judge Harrison lent him. Might be he's meant for something different." "And that's fine," Lila said firmly. "We've built something good here, but it's not their destiny unless they choose it." This conversation marked a shift in how they thought about their legacy. The mercantile had been everything for so long, but their true legacy was their children and the values they instilled in them: honesty, compassion, resilience, and the courage to face challenges head-on. In 1902, William announced at age 17 that he wanted to attend university in Denver to study law. Carson and Lila supported his decision wholeheartedly, proud of his ambition and intelligence. It meant losing his help at the mercantile, but they'd long since hired enough employees to manage without family labor. Sarah, at 14, showed no interest in business or academics but a passionate love for horses and ranching. Carson arranged for her to spend time working on his ranch, learning from his foreman and the hands. She took to it naturally, and Carson saw in her the rancher he'd once been, before illness had redirected his path. Thomas, at 7, was still young enough that his interests changed weekly. One day he wanted to be a shopkeeper like his parents, the next a train conductor, the next a soldier. Carson and Lila encouraged all his dreams equally, knowing he'd find his way in time. The years rolled on, each bringing its own joys and challenges. William graduated from university with honors, and returned to Rock Springs to establish a small law practice, becoming one of the first lawyers actually from the town, rather than an outsider who'd moved in. His first major case involved defending a rancher against fraudulent land claims, and his victory established his reputation. Sarah, to no one's surprise, convinced Carson to let her take over management of his ranch when she turned 21 in 1909. She moved out to the ranch house, hired good hands, and ran the operation with skill and innovation. She introduced new breeding techniques and improved grazing rotation, increasing the ranch's profitability significantly. She also broke several hearts around Rock Springs, having no interest in the young men who courted her but falling hard for a horse trainer who passed through town. They married in 1910, and her husband joined her in running the ranch. Thomas proved to have an artistic temperament, showing talent in drawing and painting. At 15, he announced he wanted to study art, which concerned Carson initially. How would an artist make a living? But Lila reminded him of their promise to let their children choose their own paths. They sent Thomas to study in Denver, where he flourished and eventually became a commercial illustrator, designing advertisements and catalog images that were in high demand. By 1912, Carson was 56 years old, and the years were beginning to show. His hair had gone gray, his face lined by sun and time, and his tremors had worsened somewhat with age. The medication still helped, but he tired more easily than he once had. Lila, at 52, remained energetic and sharp as ever, though she'd begun to let their employees handle more of the daily mercantile operations while she focused on strategic planning and major decisions. They'd begun talking seriously about eventually selling the mercantile and retiring, perhaps traveling to see parts of the country they'd never visited. But then William came to them with a proposal. "What if instead of selling to strangers, you sell to me?" he suggested one Sunday dinner. "I could run it alongside my law practice, at least for a while, keep it in the family. Eventually, maybe one of my children will take it over." William had married a schoolteacher named Margaret 2 years earlier, and they were expecting their first child. Carson and Lila exchanged glances, communicating without words in the way long married couples do. The idea appealed to both of them, keeping the mercantile in the family, ensuring William's financial security, maintaining their legacy in Rock Springs. "Let's talk about terms," Lila said with a smile, and William grinned, knowing that meant yes. The transition happened gradually over the next year. William hired a manager to handle daily operations while he learned the broader business from his mother, and Carson taught him about the ranching equipment side and relationship management with their larger customers. By late 1913, William owned the mercantile, and Carson and Lila had officially retired. Retirement suited them. They traveled by train to San Francisco and spent a month exploring the city, marveling at how different it was from Wyoming. They visited Sarah's ranch frequently, delighting in watching their daughter run a successful operation and enjoying their first grandchild, Sarah's daughter Helen. They spent time with Thomas in Denver, seeing his artwork displayed in galleries and businesses throughout the city. But mostly, they enjoyed each other's company. After 30 years of marriage, they still found endless things to talk about, still laughed at each other's jokes, still held hands when they walked down the street. Carson's tremors were now quite pronounced, bad enough that strangers sometimes stared, but neither of them cared. They'd long since stopped worrying about what others thought. One autumn evening in 1915, they sat on the porch of their apartment, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The mercantile below them bustled with evening customers. William's voice occasionally audible through the floorboards as he helped someone find what they needed. "Do you have any regrets?" Lila asked suddenly. Carson considered the question seriously. "Not about anything important. I wish I could have done more physical work, been less limited by my hands, but that's minor in the grand scheme of things. I used to regret that my father didn't get to see me marry you, meet his grandchildren, watch the mercantile grow," Lila admitted. "But I've made peace with it. I think he'd be proud of what we built together." "I know he would be," Carson assured her. "You took what he started and made it something even greater." "We did," Lila corrected. "It was always we, Carson. From the moment you offered to help with that grain sack, we've been a team." Carson smiled, reaching for her hand. His fingers trembled against hers, but her grip was steady and sure, just as it had been that night so many years ago when she'd said, "I know," and changed the course of both their lives. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over Rock Springs, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Inside, they could hear the mercantile closing for the night, their son counting the day's receipts and locking up, continuing the legacy they'd built together. Out at the ranch, their daughter was probably checking on her horses one last time before bed. In Denver, their youngest was likely working late in his studio, perfecting some illustration. Their children were grown and thriving, following their own paths, but carrying the values their parents had instilled. The business they'd built was secure and prospering under new management. They had grandchildren now and would likely have more. Their love story, which had begun in tragedy and been tested by illness, had resulted in a life rich with meaning and connection. "I love you," Carson said, the words as sincere as the first time he'd spoken them. "I know," Lila replied with a gentle smile, using the words that had become their private phrase, their reminder of the moment everything changed. "I love you too." In the years that followed, they continued to enjoy their retirement and watch their family grow. William and Margaret had 3 children, giving Carson and Lila additional grandchildren to dote on. Sarah's ranch expanded, and she and her husband had 2 more children. Thomas married a fellow artist and they settled in Denver, creating a life filled with creativity and beauty. Carson's health gradually declined as he aged, the tremors becoming more severe and other age-related ailments developing. But he faced these challenges with the same courage he'd shown throughout his life, never complaining, always finding humor even in difficult moments. Lila remained his constant companion and caregiver, just as she'd promised all those years ago. In the spring of 1920, Carson fell ill with pneumonia. At 64, his body didn't have the strength to fight it off as it might have when he was younger. The doctor was honest with Lila, it didn't look good. She moved a chair beside his bed and barely left his side, holding his trembling hand and talking to him about their life together. Their children gathered, bringing grandchildren to say goodbye. William sat with his father and told him how the mercantile was doing, sharing business news as they'd always done. Sarah described new colts born on the ranch, knowing her father loved hearing about the horses. Thomas brought sketches to show him, drawings of the family and the landscapes Carson had loved, on a quiet morning as dawn broke over the prairie, with Lila holding his hand and their children surrounding the bed. Carson Everett passed peacefully in his sleep. His last words, whispered to Lila alone, were "Thank you for seeing me." And Lila whispered back, "Thank you for letting me." The funeral was attended by most of Rock Springs and people from the surrounding area. Carson had been respected and loved, known for his fairness, kindness, and courage in facing his illness without complaint. Speaker after speaker rose to share stories how Carson had helped them, advised them, made them laugh, treated them with dignity. But it was Lila who spoke most movingly about her husband. She stood before the assembled crowd, no longer the young woman who'd lost her father, but a woman aged by time and now grief, yet still strong and dignified. "My husband's hands trembled from the day I met him," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But those trembling hands built a business, held our children, supported our community, and loved me every day for 37 years. They were the strongest hands I ever knew, not despite their weakness, but because of the courage it took to keep using them. Carson taught me that strength isn't about being without weakness, it's about facing your weakness with honesty and courage. He was the best man I ever knew, and I will love him until my last breath and beyond." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Lila lived another 12 years after Carson's death. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with watching her children's continued success, with serving her community in various charitable capacities. But everyone who knew her said she was never quite the same after losing Carson. It was as if part of her light had dimmed. She remained mentally sharp and physically capable until the very end, still advising William on business matters and Sarah on ranch decisions, still offering wisdom to Thomas about his career. But there was a loneliness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of waiting. In the summer of 1932, at age 72, Lila Dawson Everett passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was buried beside Carson in the Rock Springs Cemetery, their graves marked by a simple stone that read, "Carson Everett 1856-1920, and Lila Dawson Everett 1860-1932, together always." Their story became part of Rock Springs lore, told and retold over the years, the rancher with trembling hands and the mercantile owner's daughter who loved him, who built a life and legacy together, despite challenges that might have defeated lesser people. It was a story about courage and love, about seeing beyond surface weakness to inner strength, about partnership and perseverance. The mercantile remained in the family for another generation, with William's eldest son taking it over in the 1940s. The ranch thrived under Sarah's management, and then her children's. Thomas's artwork became collectible, with pieces displayed in museums throughout the West. The Everett name became synonymous with integrity and community service in Rock Springs. But beyond business success and family legacy, Carson and Lila's story endured because it spoke to fundamental truths about human connection. It showed that love could flourish in unexpected places, between unexpected people. That vulnerability could be a strength rather than weakness. That accepting help wasn't admitting defeat but embracing connection. That facing illness and uncertainty with courage was possible when you didn't face it alone. Their granddaughter Helen, Sarah's eldest, became a writer in her later years and penned a memoir about growing up in the Everett family. In it, she included stories her grandmother Lila had told her about meeting Carson, about those trembling hands, and the moment she'd held them steady. "My grandmother told me once," Helen wrote, "that the bravest thing she ever did wasn't taking over the mercantile after her father died, or fighting to keep it running as a woman in a man's business world. It was choosing to love a man she knew would need her help, whose illness would progressively worsen, who could offer her nothing but uncertainty. But she also said it was the easiest choice she ever made, because she knew in her heart he was the right man. Love," she told me, "isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections you can embrace, whose struggles you can support, whose dreams you can share." That's what she and my grandfather had, a love built not on fantasy, but on honest acceptance of each other's complete humanity. This memoir introduced the story to a wider audience, and it resonated with readers across the country. During the Depression era, when so many people faced hardship and uncertainty, the tale of Carson and Lila's triumph over adversity provided hope and inspiration. The old mercantile building still stood in Rock Springs through the decades, changing hands eventually but retaining its character. The apartment above, where Carson and Lila had raised their children and built their life, was preserved by the family and eventually donated to the local historical society. Visitors could walk through the rooms and imagine the life that had unfolded there, the meals shared, the children raised, the quiet moments when two people who loved each other sat together and found peace. Carson's trembling hands, which he'd once viewed as a curse and tried so desperately to hide, became a symbol of something greater: the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to ask for help, the wisdom to accept limitations without letting them define you. Lila's steady grip, which had held those trembling hands that pivotal night and countless times after, became a symbol of unwavering support, of love that sees beyond surface flaws to the person underneath. Their love story proved that the most profound connections often come from our moments of greatest vulnerability, that admitting weakness can lead to finding strength, that sometimes the things we're most ashamed of become the bridges that connect us to others. Carson's illness, which seemed destined to isolate and diminish him, instead led him to the greatest love of his life and a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, what Carson and Lila built together transcended any single business or material success. They created a family bound by love and mutual respect. They contributed to their community in countless ways. They showed others through their example that challenges could be overcome, that love could endure, that life could be beautiful even when it wasn't perfect. The story of his trembling hands and her steady grip, of her saying, "I know," and choosing love despite uncertainty, lived on long after they were gone. It was told by their children to their grandchildren, written about in local histories, and eventually, through Helen's memoir, shared with the wider world. It endured because it was fundamentally true, not just the facts of their lives, but the deeper truth about human connection, courage, and love. In a world that often demands perfection and fears vulnerability, Carson and Lila's story was a reminder that our imperfections don't disqualify us from love or happiness. Sometimes, they're exactly what leads us to both. And so their legacy lived on, not in buildings or businesses, though those remained, but in the lives they touched and the example they set. In every person who chose courage over fear, vulnerability over pretense, love over safety. In everyone who held steady when someone else's hands trembled, who said, "I know," and chose to stay anyway. The Wild West was a harsh place, full of violence and hardship, but it was also a place where people could reinvent themselves, where unconventional paths were possible, where love could bloom in unlikely soil. Carson and Lila's story was quintessentially Western, marked by resilience, independence, and the willingness to face challenges head-on. But it was also universally human, touching on themes that transcended time and place. Their grave in Rock Springs remained a quiet testament to their life together. Visitors would sometimes stop there, reading the simple inscription and remembering the story if they knew it. The stone was weathered now by decades of Wyoming wind and weather, but the words remained clear, "Together always," and in a sense they were. Not in any mystical or supernatural way, but in the legacy they'd created together, the family they'd raised, the values they'd instilled, the example they'd set. In every choice their descendants made to face challenges with courage, to love despite uncertainty, to see beyond surface weakness to inner strength in all of these. Carson and Lila lived on. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and the passing of years. But the truth at its heart remained eternal. That love, real love, doesn't flinch from weakness or illness or uncertainty. It steadies trembling hands and says, "I know, I see you completely, flaws and all, and I choose you anyway." That kind of love can weather any storm, overcome any obstacle, and build something that endures long after individual lives have ended. This was the legacy of Carson Everett, whose hands trembled from a sickness he tried to hide, and Lila Dawson Everett, who held them steady and saw not weakness but courage, not limitation but possibility, not endings but beginnings. Together, they proved that the most beautiful stories often start with our most vulnerable moments, and that the strongest love is built not on perfection, but on honest acceptance of our complete, imperfect humanity.